So he was bringing Kriya Yoga to the West. That was his destiny, which, according to what I've read, was told to his parents when he was an infant that he would have that kind of mission. And his guru, Sri Yukteswar, had been told by his guru that he would one day have a disciple who would go to America. And Sri Yukteswar recognized in young Yogananda, before he was called Yogananda, that he would be that one. And he was essentially trained for that mission.
I'd like to welcome to the show Philip Goldberg. How you doing, Philip?
I'm well, thank you, Alex. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you so much for coming on the show. You and I have a love for a certain guru who walked the earth a few years ago and really threw the earth upside down a little bit, especially the West. Kind of tossed and turned and was a very strong spiritual teacher. And everyone who's ever listened to any of my episodes knows that that person is Paramahansa Yogananda. And he very famously wrote a little book called The Autobiography of a Yogi, which is that
Not
book
so
that
little.
Not so, no, it's about how 800 pages. It's a lot.
500 and something.
Yeah, it's a lot of pages. But that book really transformed a lot of people's lives. It's still transforming people's lives to this day. But you decided to write a book called The Life of Yogananda, which seems counterproductive since he already wrote an autobiography. So
yes.
Why did you decide?
It was the first question I was asked.
But he already wrote an autobiography. Why do you want to do it? So can you explain to everybody, first of all, who Yogananda was and what drew you to his life and his teachings, and then why you wrote this book?
Okay, we'll go in that order then. Yogananda was possibly the most important of the spiritual teachers who came to the West from India. But by most important, I mean the most influential. Mm-hmm. Certainly in the top three. Mm-hmm. My prior book was called American Veda, and that covered the whole history of how India's ancient spiritual teachings found its way into America and transformed the cultural and spiritual landscape of the country in a way that's rarely appreciated sufficiently. Yogananda was a key player. He came here in 1920. There hadn't been that many Indian gurus prior to that. His illustrious predecessor, Swami Vivekananda, came to the U.S. actually the same year Yogananda was born, 1893. And Swamis in his lineage were in America at the time Yogananda came, but they were pretty low key. Yogananda was the first to gain prominence and stay here. He spent the last 32 years of his life in America. And so he had the time and the energy and the skill and the charisma to reach a great number of people, and left behind, when he passed in 1952, his famous autobiography of a yogi, which has been called one of the most important spiritual books of the 20th century. And as you said, to this day, people's lives are changed by it. And so when I wrote American Veda, I had a chapter on Yogananda and his impact. And afterward, in thinking, what do I want to do next? It kept coming to me, what an interesting human life Yogananda led. And I couldn't do it justice in the 20 some odd pages I could, devote to it in the previous book. So I said, that's a story that should be told. But I had the same thought you did. But, why write a biography of somebody who's famous for an autobiography? So I reread Autobiography of a Yogi for, the fourth or fifth time or whatever, and did a page count and realized that less than 10% of that book is about his life after the age of 27 when he came to America.
Hmm.
And there were passages that read like, and then 4 years passed in Boston. And I
Right.
thought, well, no, you can't get away with that. His first stop was Boston in 1920. He was there for the first 4 years he was in America. How did he survive? What did he do? How did he, fulfill his mission? How did he deal with winter in New England? Give me details. So I said, okay, there are gaps in his personal story and someone should fill them. So I took it on. That's essentially what happened.
So Yogananda was doing the yada yada yada. I moved to LA.
Well, in a sense. And also, what's interesting is it's called Autobiography of a Yogi, but a big portion of it is about other people he's met, interesting people, saints, scientists, all kind of holy people, miracle workers, his gurus. Uh, yeah, and so the actual autobiography portion of it left a lot out. And
Mm.
so, that fascinated me. I had already gotten hints in my prior research that there were stories to tell that he didn't tell and details that are worth knowing. And a human story that holds up as a narrative that we can all learn from.
Where does one go for information like this? Because I'm assuming it's a self-realization fellowship, which is his organization, because they're the ones that house pretty much everything that's available on Yogananda, but most of that stuff's not public. So
That's right.
how did you get
That's
access
right.
to these stories?
Good question. Um, for one thing, there's more available in public domain than people realize. Obscure, articles and journals or,
Mhm.
memoirs written by people who knew him. But, including one by his brother who wrote about their childhood.
Mm.
But you're right. The principal archive is held in LA by the Self-Realization Fellowship. So I could not have undertaken the project without their cooperation. Uh, it's not like there's a room and they said, here's the key, go. I
Read.
I had a liaison who was essentially, the most knowledgeable historian in the organization, and I would ask questions. That person would bring me documents from the archive or an explanation, an answer, and that was invaluable.
Mm.
And then in the process, people outside of self-realization fellowship, there, like any other spiritual organization, there's always breakaway groups, small ones, but some of them were people or started by people who were direct disciples of Yogananda. And they had stories, they had documents, they had letters. And people heard I was doing this and they said, oh, I've got this file cabinet full of stuff. And you find things and people hear about you. So you just do your homework. And some of it was things like going into the Los Angeles Times archive and seeing articles from the 1920s and 30s, uh, travel documents from, his passport and when he left the country, and, they're things that you come across, and it adds, also went to India and talked to people there, his sort of family members, who didn't necessarily know him because, he died in 1952, but who had letters and who had stories. And, so you just do
Yeah.
your research.
So let me ask you this then. What happened to him? I always wondered that too about those 4 years in Boston, because he shows up, he's horrified that they're selling hot dogs. He thinks, "Oh my God, what kind of country have you brought me to that they eat dogs?" Uh, those kind of stories. Um, but what did he do those years? Because he came essentially on a boat, showed up. No one knows who he is. He is dressed in a way that people from the 1920s in Boston, he looked essentially like an alien, because people they've heard of India maybe, but they have never seen an Indian, let
Or
alone
if
a
they
young.
did, maybe a few rarefied people did. As I said, there were,
Right.
the occasional yoga person. Swami Vivekananda had spent time there 20 or so years earlier. But you're right, 1920, it was he arrived 2 months before women voted for the first time. That's a
Jeez.
long time ago.
Yeah.
And racism was ascendant. The Ku Klux Klan was had a huge revival at that time. So if you look at his passport photo, you see him bearded. He shaved his beard on the boat because people warned him that he didn't want to stand out that much in in the streets, but he didn't cut his hair. He had, that would have been a violation of the order of swamis that he was in. Um, and he learned over time to do things like tuck his long hair into his collar, in the back, and wear a hat and wear Western clothing when he was in public. But, at first he didn't. But he wasn't entirely a stranger, because he came to speak at a conference that was being held in Boston. And he had acquired he was substituting for the originally scheduled representative of Hinduism in this interfaith
Conference.
setting.
Yeah.
Um, and, was very young, was very uncertain about his command of English, but he came here and stayed in a YMCA for a few days before the sponsors of the conference, housed him in a proper way, and ended up staying. And there's a lot of funny stories of his adjusting to American life, riding a subway for the first time, not knowing how a drinking fountain operated, and being a vegetarian and all that. There's a lot of funny stories. But on the other hand, there was harassment too. And, he was a dark-skinned foreigner at a time when even the Irish and Jews were being discriminated against, so you can imagine.
So he did, I would imagine he had some struggles, and I mean, did he have a job to pay
No,
the
no,
bills?
no.
How did, no, so who was paying his bills these 4 years while he was there?
You're asking the kind of questions a biographer has to ask. He had some money from his father. He was raised in an affluent household
Mhm.
by a hardworking father who worked for the British railway system. And also, it should be noted, this is 27 years before India gained its independence. So he was a subject of the British Empire and
Mhm.
could have been deported at any time. And they were spying on him because didn't they were on the lookout for people raising money and guns in the West to support the freedom movement. And the more prominent it became, the more they looked out, kept an eye on him. But so he came to speak at this conference. His father had given him some money and paid for the ship's passage. And then he said, if I'll be back unless the Americans need me. And after his first talk at that conference, which was his talk was titled The Science of Religion, he hung around and waited to see what would happen. And then somebody invited him to speak at a church outside of Cambridge in Somerville, Massachusetts. And people heard him speak. And so somebody said, oh, I have a study group, come speak in my living room. And it was the same kind of story that every visiting guru or Buddhist monk or whatever followed. Started out small with a small group of people who liked what he had to say and supported him and paid, had some money, helped out, arranging for him to speak here and there. And so it went from 10, 15 people in someone's living room to a few years later, filling Symphony Hall in Boston. It just grew in that way. And there were always money issues and always organizational issues that he had to deal with. And those kind of concerns only grew as his fame and success grew.
Now, you mentioned that he had a mission in this life to do something. What exactly were the parameters of that mission?
Yeah, it wasn't, like a mission statement that we're used to,
Sure,
carefully,
of course.
carefully crafted by,
But since we've already seen what he did, we could kind of guess what his mission
That's
was.
right.
So,
well,
the
mission was essentially to bring the teachings of the Indian tradition, what we think of now as Hinduism, but it really certain core philosophical and principles and methods, practices that we think of as yoga, the yoga philosophy, yoga practices, Vedanta philosophy. So not all of Hinduism, which is very vast and diverse, but certain core principles that were acceptable to Western culture, Western thinkers, Western values. And in particular, the teachings of his particular lineage, which he called Kriya Yoga. So he was bringing Kriya Yoga, which, embedded in the larger overall principles of the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita to the West. That was his, destiny, which, according to what I've read, was told to his parents when he was an infant that he would have that kind of mission. And his guru, Sri Yukteswar, had been told by his guru that he would one day have a disciple who would go to America. And Sri Yukteswar recognized in young Yogananda, before he was called Yogananda, that he would be that one. And he was essentially trained for that mission.
And he also, when he brought over Kriya Yoga and aspects of the yoga philosophies and things like that, he also introduced meditation. Is he the first to do? Is he the first to do meditation, or was the other Swamis? I mean, in a big way.
Well, first to make it accessible to that number of people. Yes, Swami Vivekananda is known mostly for articulating Vedanta philosophy in a way that he sort of set the template for how to use, which language to use, what to emphasize to the
Hmm.
Westerners. And his swamis carried that on. But they had meditation practices.
Hmm.
They just, it was more low key. Yogananda reached far more people and perhaps taught more systematic methods
Mm.
of meditation practices, we should say, because that wasn't just. And then, that set the stage for the 1960s and 70s when there were a whole lot of gurus. And when the Beatles picked up on transcendental meditation, that, of course, that exploded. And so what Vivekananda started and Yogananda brought forth to large numbers of people eventually became mainstream in America through this succession of teachers and the available access to, through technology and so forth.
Now, you brought up the Beatles because it's probably one of my favorite bands of all time. Is I'm not alone in that. And I was fascinated to know that I was a Beatles fan all my life, but I had no idea the impact that Yogananda and Autobiography of a Yogi had on them. So much so that his lineage is in Sergeant Pepper's
Yeah,
the
the
album
famous
Sergeant Pepper. You could
cover.
the famous cover. You see
Yeah, yeah.
Yogananda, Babaji, Yukteswar. I think Lahira Mahashai is in there as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, all
Um,
four.
all four of them are in there, and I was like, oh my, how did they? What is happening? It
I'll
blew
tell
my
you,
mind. Tell me how that happened. Please
it's
tell me.
it's George.
Yeah.
George was the driving spiritual force
Mm-hmm.
of the Beatles, and if after the Beatles broke up, George was such a sincere yogi and practitioner, um, and that carried through to the rest of his life. And I've given presentations just about George, and you could see it in the lyrics of his some of the songs he wrote with the Beatles, and then later in his solo career. He was a strong advocate of Indian philosophy and Indian spirituality, and a real sincere seeker. And it started with him uh, musically when he discovered the sitar and went to India to study with Ravi Shankar. And Ravi
Mm-hmm.
Shankar gave him two books, one of which was Autobiography of a Yogi, and the other was one of Vivekananda's books called Raj Yoga. And those transformed George's life. There's actually four or five different guru lineages that have a claim on George. So, when they were conceiving the album cover for Sergeant Pepper, which came out in 1967, each of the Beatles could choose four cultural icons to put on the cover. So you see Muhammad Ali and Bob Dylan and uh, Mae West and W.C. Fields and all these
Mm-hmm.
people. George's four were the four gurus.
Wow, I didn't know that one. That was a
Yeah.
new little bit of information because it
And
blew my
and and it
mind.
should be said that over the course of his life, he would keep stacks of autobiography around to
Hmm.
give to people. But the transcendental meditation people, the Vedanta Society people, the Hare Krishnas, because George was a big devotee and of chanting and they all have a claim on George. But he was,
But George put the four
yes,
gurus on the cover, so that says something. I'm just throwing that out there.
oh yeah,
Not that
says
it's
a
a
lot.
competition. It says a
And he
lot of.
would go and visit SRF when he was in LA, and he would give out copies of Autobiography of a Yogi. But he didn't limit himself to any one, uh,
Yes, as he shouldn't, as he shouldn't. And
as
Yogananda
he
would be the
should.
first to say, as Yogananda would be the first to say that is like
That's quite right.
to go to all teachings. One thing that I found really fascinating when I first was introduced to Yogananda, I was introduced to Autobiography of a Yogi when I was in my mid-20s. I started reading it, could not, I was so not ready. I'm just so not ready for it. I was reading, I'm like, guys, levitating, biolocation, this this guru walking around who's still alive after 2,500 years in the Himalayas. Like, it was so far out of my comfort zone that I put the book away. It was only until my mid 30s where I picked it up again. And then I started to understand. And then I started to really dig deep into it. But what I found fascinating about Yogananda that kind of, I think, set him apart from his contemporaries is that he brought Jesus Christ into the mix.
Oh man, big time.
Yeah, and he was talking about Jesus and he put them up there. He put Jesus up there with his other lineage and that Jesus
Yeah.
was part of his lineage. And that was such a, I'm not saying it was a smart marketing play, but
Well,
I don't think he was looking at it that way. But in hindsight, it opened the door to so many people in the West because everyone here knows Jesus. That, you know, the West was basically, you know, built upon Christian values and, you know, so on and so forth. But it was really fascinating. What do you know about that? And why are you laughing
well,
so
I
much?
could, you've touched on a lot of things. First of all, I want to say for your listeners, I teach courses from time to time through Hindu University of America, hua.edu. They have a wonderful curriculum of classes and online courses. And one of the courses I do is going through autobiography of a yogi, chapter by chapter. And so I would invite people to look at that. And because I bring in all the stuff that's not in the book that I learned in my own research. But about the presence of Jesus, one thing that is common across the Eastern traditions, essentially, you know, if you go to India and you mention Jesus, people just think of him as a great spiritual teacher.
Mhm.
And they're happy to, you know, extol him and quote him and all that. And all the gurus who came here had nothing but respect and reverence for Jesus. It's very common. It's one of the beautiful things about the Hindu and Buddhist cultures is the openness to, you know, any great saint or teacher. Yogananda took that to another level. He didn't just hold Jesus up and quote him and hold him up as an example. He claimed that Jesus was essentially part of his own lineage and that he and the aforementioned Babaji, the deathless yogi, are in some kind of communication. And um, you know, Yogananda's whole mission is essentially, you know, endorsed and set up by them. He spoke about Jesus so much that there's a 2-volume set
Right behind
totaling
me.
about 1,200 pages.
It's sitting
That's
right
on your
there.
shelf, I'm sure.
Yeah, right
Yep,
there.
I see it next to the Gita.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's called The Second Coming of Christ, and it was assembled by his devotees after he died of everything he said and wrote about Jesus. So it's a lot. And he mastered, you know, how to talk about it and how to bring Jesus. It's not the interpretation of Jesus you'll find in the you know, next Sunday's sermon wherever you are. It's a more esoteric one, of course, but it's fascinating. And you're absolutely right. I know you were joking when you called it a marketing ploy, but he was accused of that. He was accused of that. You know, he's selling out to the Christians, he's pandering to them, you know, putting up Jesus and all that. But it was sincere. You know,
Mm.
when they acquired the property that to this day is the headquarters of SRF
Mhm.
internationally on a hilltop in LA.
Mhm.
He scheduled the opening of that in 1925 for Easter Sunday morning.
Mhm.
And, you know, every Christmas he celebrated, you know, in ways that, you know, many Christians don't, you know, all day meditation practice on the day before, and then of course gift giving and food and celebratory thing. He was very sincere in his reverence for Jesus as an avatar, as a great saint, right up there with his own tradition of Krishna and that sort of thing. So it was sincere. Did it also work as a marketing device? Sure, because it assuaged the conscience of many people who were curious about him and attracted to him, but also felt very strongly about their roots in Christianity. But let's not also overlook the fact that it was a turnoff for many people.
Yeah. Yeah. Who
It's,
were searching
I interviewed.
they're searching for something other than Jesus, like, man, Jesus is here again. Kind of vibe.
I've interviewed so many people, and for one thing, Jews and atheists, they had a little trouble with this Jesus presence, and many Christians who had given up, who had rejected the church and their own Christian roots, had to suddenly say, "Wait a minute, what's this about?" and wrestle with that, and then, but more common were Christians who had been alienated from their faith, from their tradition, usually when they're high school or college age and all that, and found their way back to it through Yogananda, because the interpretation, they through Yogananda, they found a Jesus they could love again.
You know what?
Like they did when they were kids.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, I mean, I think that's essentially what happened to me, because I'm a recovering Catholic, as I always joke. And I was introduced to that, but I rejected the church years ago because plot holes in the story and the yada yada. Jesus is from 13 to 30. Which they talk about as possible time in India and all this kind of stuff, which I'll ask you about in a second. But I always loved the teachings of Jesus. Just take religion out of it. Just as a human being to another human being, his teachings are beautiful. But it was all mixed up in this dogma and fear and anger that I just couldn't grab onto. But through Yogananda, you open up that door again to his teachings, and you like, oh, that's the Jesus. I can hang with that guy, because he's not going to judge me. He's not going to do this or that. And now it's my mission in life to constantly ask questions about everything that had to do with the entire picture.
Your story mirrors a lot. In fact, it's a variation of my own story, and I've written about this. I usually every Christmas I try to republish this essay I wrote about my own path. I was raised by atheist Jews to think religion was for fools. And I had no religious training or whatever. And I knew very little about it. I just, like everybody else raised in America, about Christmas and Easter and you hear this stuff. But after getting into Indian philosophy and starting my own meditation practice and everything, I read Autobiography of a Yogi. And I said, holy, he writes about Jesus a lot. What's going on here? What have I missed? Maybe I missed something. So I got a New Testament and read it. Mm-hmm. And I had already read the Bhagavad Gita. I had already read some of the Upanishads and all this literature. So I'm reading the New Testament for the first time. And my thought was, oh, I get it. He was a guru. He was a yoga master. He had disciples, and it's just like the Upanishads. And so suddenly I found myself being open to stuff, and I started realizing how much I like Christmas carols. So I check out a different church every Christmas Eve to have a birthday party for a great yogi.
It is beautiful.
That's what
It is beautiful.
happens.
If you're enjoying this conversation, I invite you to go deeper down the rabbit hole with me on Next Level Soul TV. It's packed with exclusive content like live special guest Q&As, daily podcasts, commercial-free access to the entire Next Level Soul catalog, early access to episodes before they air, and special meditations you won't find anywhere else. We will be adding new exclusive content every month, plus you can connect with me during my monthly live streams. Just go to nextlevelsoul.com/subscribe and join our soulful community today. I'll see you on the inside. So let me ask you this. In your research following Yogananda's life, when you went down the rabbit hole of Jesus's connection with Yogananda, did you find out any stories about the time between the years 13 and 30, where there's a lot of Jesus in India ideas or Tibetan? My understanding is India, Tibet, and Egypt. Those were the three places that he kind of hung out for a minute.
Oh, also, I've heard Persia.
Yeah,
which is
around that same
now Iran. Yeah.
Yeah, and that just general area.
I heard all the stories, and it wasn't just in researching Yogananda's life, and I've taken tour groups to India. I've, investigated all the different gurus' teachings and everything. And you hear these stories, there's even films made about Jesus in India. People have been speculating about those missing years forever. And it's plausible. I mean, people did travel from what we think of as the Holy Land and from Greece, overland to Alexander the Great went to India, well, what's now Pakistan. He met yogis. It said that Pythagoras and other Greek philosophers had contacts with Indian sages because there were trade routes between the Middle East and Greece and India. But what actually happened, I have no idea.
They didn't have the film cameras back then.
I always joke that, if you're in India, especially if you're in Kashmir, which is one of the legends, for a few rupees, somebody will show you where Jesus is actually buried.
Exactly.
He wasn't really crucified, that he found his way to India and spent, his life in the Himalayas and all.
I've heard all those stories as well. I heard that Mother Mary died along the route and that she's buried somewhere in Pakistan. That it was the Da Vinci Code. He was married. He had kids. Mary Magdalene was not a whore. He was his wife. And apparently the proprietor of his entire mission, Jesus, because someone had to pay the bills for Jesus, and she came for money, apparently. So these are stories we all hear. Have you heard these stories?
I've heard stories, many stories like that. This is the first time I heard of Mary Magdalene being the financier of the organization. I knew, they presumably they were husband and wife. I mean, people are going. I've heard so many stories about so many legendary people. You live in LA, you hear stories about celebrities. So why not Jesus?
Exactly. Now, we touched upon a very pivotal figure in the autobiography of a yogi and in Yogananda's life, which is Mahavatar Babaji. And Babaji is one of the most fascinating characters in the autobiography of a yogi. Can you talk a little bit about Babaji, what he's doing, what impact he had on Yogananda? Because apparently Yogananda, I think, met him twice or three times, I'm not mistaken, in the book, at least. I think at least twice, but it might be three times in his life, where he actually had a conversation with the real Babaji, and other than stories that he heard from his guru. But can you talk a little bit about Babaji and his impact on this work, Yogananda's life, and his impact on the world?
Well, again, we're in the realm of what's true, what's mythology, what's good storytelling. I'm not qualified to know. But Babaji is a legendary yogi in the Himalayas who, had such mastery of mind over matter, of consciousness, that he didn't age and has lived for hundreds of years. And there are people today who claim to have met him and been ordained by him to have some teaching mission. Are they lying? Are they deluded? Is it real? I have no idea. I once met somebody who claimed to be Babaji. That guy was deluded, but that was just too obvious. But who knows? But in Yogananda's world, you could say Babaji is the custodian of the Kriya Yoga lineage and appeared to Yogananda's guru's guru and Lahiri Mahasya when he was a young man and said, you will bring out these teachings from the obscurity that they've fallen into and make them more widely available. And you will do it without giving up your job and your role as a husband.
Father and a father. Yeah.
And so you will set an example that these teachings are not just for renunciates, but for, people living in the world. And that was Lahiri Mahasya. Then he had a disciple named Sri Yukteswar, who was also a householder until, he was a widower and took renunciate vows. And he became Yogananda's guru. So the lineage is passed down from Babaji to Lahiri Mahasya to Sri Yukteswar to Yogananda. And of course, lesser known gurus who had their own branches of that lineage. Yogananda's not the only one. Other disciples of Lahiri and Yukteswar had their own smaller institutions. So that's who he presumably is and is presumably still alive. And as I said, people claim all kinds of things. Who knows what's true? But that's the legend of Babaji. And
No.
I've taken tour groups to places in India where there's one place where the Yogananda's lineage maintains that it's a cave where Babaji lived, and where and these are powerful places and they're powerful stories, and some people believe them and some people don't. But I always like to say it doesn't matter. The teachings are the teachings. The methods of Kriya Yoga, just like the methods of other yoga lineages, they work. They have an effect on people. That's what really matters. And, whether you believe Yogananda's stories or not, whether you talked earlier about reading autobiography and your reaction to all the miracles and the healings and the feats of yogic powers and all that. My experience with people is there are two kinds of people who really love the autobiography of a yogi. People who love the miracles and can't get enough of them, and people who don't believe a word of it, but they get a lot out of the book for other reasons, because the book is a lot of things there's a lot in there. And every time I reread it to teach one of those courses I mentioned, I find something new, and there's a lot there. So some people just poo-poo the miracles or say, well, some of them may be true, but I don't believe this one and that one. And I think Yogananda was fooled or whatever. Um, here's a point about it. This is interesting. They're so prominent in the book. And at the same time, if you read the commentaries about his own commentaries about, he'll tell you, but they're not what's important. What's important is the experience inside you when you practice these methods of yoga. These stories, you can believe them. They're meant to make a point. So, and that's consistent with all the great spiritual teachers, all the gurus, all the yogis, Buddha himself. They tell you, yeah, these feats of consciousness and everything, they're absolutely true. These are things that an advanced yogi can do, but they're not important. Don't get caught up in them. Don't waste your time trying to attain these things or think about them. What matters is the inner peace and the expanded awareness and the love that these methods bring about in practice. But yet there's all these stories. So one day when I was researching my biography of him, I was meeting with Swami Chidananda, who became the head of the organization after, not long after I was meeting with him about my research. And I said, why do you think Yogananda included so much? Why there's so many of these stories in the book? And he said, he tells you in the book. I said, what do you mean? And he opens the front of the book. And if you have a copy of Autobiography of You, or if you have a copy of any book, you'll see what's called the copyright page, where, well, not the copyright page, the title page. There's always a page with just the title, the author, the publisher. On that page, there's a quote from the Bible, from the New Testament. And it says, except you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. That's from the book of John. He put it in there. It was like he's telling you at the beginning, that's why I did this, because some people need to see miracles and everything in order to pay attention.
Yeah, pay attention. From my studies in yogic philosophies, I've understood that these powers, the yogic powers, and there's a handful of them: levitation, biolocation, manifestation, basically all the stuff that Jesus did, which again goes back to your theory of he's a great yogi. But they can be traps for the yogi going through it, because
well said.
Because you know what, when you levitate, pretty darn off cool to levitate and to show that off, the ego will come in like, you know what, I think I can show this. Or if you're able to manifest something, or if you're able to biolocate, these are things that the ego would just love, because you're so much superior to everyone else, that it is a trap for many yogis. And some yogis get caught up in that, and they just,
that's right.
They focus on just learning how to levitate for 30 years. And that's what they do, but that's not the point.
To read minds, or to
read minds.
All kinds of stuff that, and the question is, are these real? And I have no doubt that these are attainments, that have been witnessed and observed and attained. And some of them, like the mind powers, they're just, it's like, you could pick up a basketball and shoot and maybe score, because we all can do that. But not everybody's LeBron James. So we all have intuition and hunches and feelings and all that stuff. And we've experienced certain psychic things happening in our life. take that to an extreme, and you have, the LeBron Jameses of yogis doing what we think of as extraordinary things. So I have no doubt. The question is, so what? When Buddha was asked if he could perform miracles, he said, yes. When I'm hungry, I eat. When I'm thirsty, I drink. That's a miracle. Those are miracles. And, you know, so are they happy? Are they in bliss consciousness? Have they transcended the, sufferings of the world? That's why people follow yogic paths, not so they can manipulate other people with their mind or, float.
Exactly, exactly. And you mentioned Lahiri Mahashai, who's one of my favorite of the gurus because he had a family. And that's unlike most gurus are usually, they are monastic in many ways, and they stay away from having that because, and I have family. I have a family, and I always like to say, I always like to joke. I'm like, I wonder how Yogananda would have done if he had 5 kids running around and a wife and a mortgage and all this kind of stuff. It's easy to find enlightenment when you don't have to deal with that. I'm joking, but it's easier. And then Lahiri Mahashai is that one guru that I look to, like, he had a family. He had a job. He was an accountant. I mean, he still slowly but surely became the spiritual teacher. So it is doable. And Babaji, if he does exist, Babaji was so smart in allowing someone like Lahiri Mahashai to be the catalyst of Kriya Yoga as an example to others to go, no, you don't have to be in the Himalayan mountains for 100 years meditating. From what I understand now, the age, and not for everybody, but the age of this enlightenment in the Himalayas, in a cave somewhere away from the world, or even in a church, or a monk, retreat, a castle somewhere. That world is great, but from my understanding is now it's the time for them to come down from the mountains and to start doing these kind of teachings within the mass media, getting jobs within companies, doing these things to do change in the world and elevate everyone's awakening consciousness. Would you agree?
Yeah. Well, there's a role for monastics.
Correct.
Most of the teachers who came here, whether Buddhist or Hindu or whatever, were monks,
Mm-hmm.
but they taught householders.
Mm-hmm.
They made it very plain. You don't have to, many are called, but few are chosen. The great majority of human beings are meant to be in families and have careers and jobs, and that's the curriculum for
Mm-hmm.
our, most of our incarnations. But there's a role to be played for monks and nuns, and essentially they're specialists. They don't have the distractions of family life and career, so they can devote themselves fully to this. This is why Yogananda, who himself was a monk, he empowered the people around him who to run the organization and carry on his legacy. He put that in the hands of the monastics. He created a monastic order for
Mm-hmm.
Westerners. So did
Mm-hmm.
other gurus. All of them had some equivalent of that. And, it's a very attractive proposition for people who get involved in a deep, serious spiritual path. But it's not for everybody. It has its own challenges. You
Mm-hmm.
know, you give up, you're giving up a lot, and it's a lot is expected of you. You're not just sitting in a cave. You're running an organization, and you have people to deal with, and managerial responsibilities, teaching responsibilities, and all that. And you have to, remain unattached from certain things. And even it's very tempting once you get onto a yogic path to say, "Oh, all this stuff is a distraction. I'm just going to go live in an ashram or, a monastery." Maybe it'll last a short period of time before I used to joke that I did that for a while. I would go on long meditation retreats and say, "Oh, I'm not going back. I want to just do this. I'm going to take vows." And then, a week later, I'm thinking, how are the Mets doing? And
Probably not that
where are
good.
the women? Where are the women? And I wonder if the Beatles have a new album. You just some of us are not meant to be that way.
Not we all
But
have our
there's a
like we
role
all
for each.
correct. Your role was to do the work that you're doing, and you
Yeah.
couldn't do that in an ashram. I mean, you
No,
have to be out mingling with the world. And look, Yogananda, he was a person who was not in a cave somewhere. He built an organization. He traveled. He spoke. He interacted with people on a constant basis for 32 years in the United States. That is far beyond being a monk.
that's right. And and this is in my biography of him because it shows up a lot in his letters and other things. There were times when he said, "I don't want to do this anymore. This is
Right.
too much hassle. Having to think about money and these foolish people who get into squabbles with one another and aren't, and people uh, attacking me and people suing me and people making accusations and people opposing me. I just wanted to live the peaceful life of a yogi. I want to go live by the Ganges River and in the Himalayas." But it didn't, he had a mission and it wasn't to be. But there were times when the people around him thought he's not coming back. He wants to give this up, but he couldn't. It was his mission. But he had a lot of responsibility
That's a
and he
tremendous amount.
worked very hard.
It's a hell of a
And,
mission. Hell of a
anybody,
mission.
just think of it. You start a business or something. It's a lot of work. And essentially, he had a mission, and the more successful he was, the more administrative headaches, the more, public relations headaches. So, he worked. He worked very hard. And that's a great example. I've had people read my book and say, "Oh, I'm so happy that I read it because part of me wanted, thinking, why is my life so difficult?" And then I realized even Yogananda had challenges. This is life in the world. So I feel better about things now. Uh,
Yeah, and I mean, he had a lot of struggles, a lot of struggles in his day. And during the end of his life, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but he started to write like so much. He was trying to get it all out because he knew when he was going to go. He knew that the clock was running out for himself, and he was writing apparently just insanely, books after books after books, I mean, or dictating books on top of books, right?
and not only that, making sure his organization was in place for his departure, making sure it would be financially secure, making sure the people who were going to carry on his legacy were properly trained and properly oriented. He continued to give public talks, all of which were transcribed and ended up in books. So he was working very hard. He
To
stopped
the end.
traveling. First 15 years or so here, he traveled all the time. Stopped traveling after a while and just stayed in Southern California. If he were around now, he'd be making YouTube videos. In those
Absolutely.
days, he was writing books and
Right.
essays.
That was the medium of his time. That was the way to
Right.
get out to the masses. Now he would be absolutely a YouTube star. No
Mhm.
question, no question about it whatsoever. One last thing, Philip, I wanted to ask you about I heard this from somewhere, that when he died, when Yogananda passed, he basically was speaking, and he told his disciples that night, "Tonight I'm leaving you," and they're like, "No, no, no, that's
He
impossible."
didn't.
And
He didn't tell them that.
oh, he didn't say that.
No,
Okay,
but they inferred it later from some of the things he said,
got
and
it. Okay, so
that
he
he
was
knew
dropping
the
some
end. Yeah,
hints.
yeah.
But then he, in the middle of a talk, just fell, and apparently it was from cardiac arrest.
True, but it was at the end of his talk. And it was, I have to say, researching and writing that chapter about his final years and days and final night, it was really moving for me to do that. It was a beautiful thing. He had he loved his homeland. He loved India and what it stands for. And one of the poignant things was he always wanted to go back again and visit again, and he only did once in this whole time after he came here, and he wanted to go back, but he never did. But he once said that he would die with India on his lips, and he did. It was his final night was a banquet celebration. This is what, 5 years after, almost 5 years after India became independent. And the first post-independence ambassador to the US was visiting Los Angeles, and they had banquets for him, and every Yogananda hosted them. And he gave a talk at this banquet. And he concluded his talk by reading a section of a poem of his about his love for India. And as soon as he finished, he collapsed.
He died with India on his lips.
Yeah.
Now, one last thing: when he passed, the legend goes that he didn't decay, that he was as vibrant as the day he was alive, and there's video of it. There's actual film of him at his, as they were burying him, I think, or wherever, that
No,
ceremony.
yeah. But
What did you hear?
I have to be, that's all the issues I've ever seen of autobiography of Yogi have this thing about how his body didn't corrupt. And people have disputed that. For one thing, he was embalmed, and the body was open casket only for a short period of time. No one knows. No one's
For sure.
opened the casket since. And, according to one, what is it called, coroner, they were started to see some signs of decay. Others say, oh, no, the body held up much longer than is the norm, and other people would dispute that. And personally, I don't care.
Right.
I don't care.
It's fascinating, because that's basically every great spiritual teacher.
There's always legends. There's always stories. Jesus isn't the only one who was supposed to have a virgin birth or was resurrected or any of that. So you don't know what to believe. And I always thought, if they were open Yogananda's casket and find him looking like he did in 1952, it would be miraculous. But would it change anything? Would it make
No.
his methods any more valuable, any more
Well,
practical? Would it make the philosophies he espoused any less true or more true? No, that's what really matters.
do you know where he's buried? I don't know where he's buried.
In Forest Lawn Cemetery outside of Los Angeles.
He's at Forest Lawns. I didn't know he was at
Yeah,
Forest Lawns.
yeah.
My next trip to LA, I'm making a
There
visit.
was an effort to disinter it and move it to SRF's headquarters,
Sure.
but the people who live in the neighborhood stopped it. They didn't want pilgrims coming, passing, going to visit his tomb all the time.
Mm. Fair enough. Fair enough. Now, Philip, I'm going to ask you a few questions I ask all of my guests. What is your definition of living a fulfilled life?
Knowing who we truly are.
If you had a chance to go back in time and speak to little Philip, what advice would you give him?
You could have been a major league pitcher. No, I'm kidding. You
The Mets
should.
needed you. The Mets
You,
needed you.
no, I would say be grateful for every moment. Live with no regret.
How do you define God or source?
I really stay away from the G word. It means so many different things to so many
That's why
people.
I said source,
I
the
would say,
universe.
yes, that which is, always was, always will be, was never born, will never die. And to circle back to your first question, that is who we truly are.
What is love?
That which binds everything.
And what is the ultimate purpose of life?
To know who we truly are, live our full potential, and serve.
And Philip, where can people find out more about you and the amazing work you're doing in the world?
My website, philipgoldberg.com, when it's working properly, has everything. And my podcast, which is called Spirit Matters, which find at mindbodyspirit.fm. My books, of course, which you'll find out about on my website. But the website is the first stop.
And do you have any parting messages for the audience if you were channeling Yogananda today?
We live in very difficult times. Protect yourself. Find the sanctuary of peace within yourself. Anchor yourself there, and then come out and do something to help.
Philip, it has been a pleasure and honor speaking to you about your work and Yogananda. Anytime I could talk about Yogananda, I'm happy. So thank you so much for spreading
It's
his
been a
message
pleasure.
and spreading his story in the world, my friend.
Thank you. Thanks for your great questions and for the invitation. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for watching. Click on one of the videos below to continue your journey, and don't forget to subscribe.